Sign
She
these
thought she was
papers.
living
It's
her
over.
dream until the truth turned it into a nightmare. Everything seemed perfect.
How can you be
Love,
so
trust,
cruel?
a future carefully built piece by piece. But behind the calm surface, deception was growing, waiting for the right moment to break through. And when it finally does, it shatters everything she believed in.
Congratulations, we've
Yet in
finalized
that
the
moment of
adoption
pain,
papers.
something powerful is born. Because she refuses to stay broken. She rises, stronger, fearless, and ready to take back control of her life. What was meant to destroy her becomes the very thing that makes her unstoppable. The lesson? Sometimes life reveals the truth in the most painful ways, but that truth sets you free. Strength isn't about avoiding the fall, it's about how you rise after. And the moment you choose yourself, you take your power back. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue creating more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
Liam orchestrated his betrayal on the night of his crowning achievement. His wife, Eleanor, nearly 9 months pregnant and radiant in a bespoke gown, was on his arm at the lavish launch party for his new Chicago skyscraper, the Apex. After the applause for his keynote speech finally died down, he led her away from the adoring architectural critics and towards the silence of the penthouse suite. It was there, with the glittering panorama of the city laid out below, that he demolished their foundation. He told her their marriage had become a dated blueprint, functional but utterly lacking in vision. He revealed that his new partner, a notoriously ruthless real estate developer named Victoria, was the skyline he now wanted to build. He reminded her with surgical cruelty that she had shelved her own architectural photography career to champion his, had no legal claim to his new firm, and was now completely adrift. Then he turned and left, rejoining the celebration to share a glass of champagne with Victoria, the very picture of a new architectural dynasty. He left Eleanor standing alone, a discarded blueprint in the grand design of his life, her hands instinctively shielding her unborn child as her world fell away. Liam was confident he'd made a clean break, leaving Eleanor too broken to ever be a problem. But Liam, in his colossal ego, was oblivious to the fact that the quiet, unassuming tech genius she called Dad, the man he'd condescendingly dismissed as a retired coder, had just transferred his legendary $900 million Big Sur estate into her name. And every last beachfront acre now belonged to Eleanor. This is a story of towering ambition and a betrayal delivered from a great height. It's the chronicle of a man who traded a timeless landmark for a trendy facade, and the woman who used the rubble of her broken heart to construct an empire that would make his look like a temporary structure. Stay with us, because the moment Liam discovers who he truly underestimated is a reveal you will not want to miss. This story contains a truth we feel is vital for everyone. Your value is never defined by another person's failure to recognize it. The people who walk away are not subtracting from your life. They are simply clearing the site for the magnificent future you are about to build. At times, the most potent revenge isn't a showdown, but a future so spectacular and influential that the one who tried to tear you down becomes an irrelevant footnote in your blueprints. If this resonates with you, please hit that like button, let us know where you're from in the comments, pass this story on to someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss our next empowering story. Liam was convinced his wife would simply fade away. He had rehearsed it for weeks from his design studio overlooking Millennium Park, envisioning Eleanor's quiet, graceful collapse, and the only emotion he registered was a deep, satisfying sense of freedom. No remorse, no hesitation, and certainly no affection. He had watched her earlier in the evening, her pregnant silhouette framed by the city lights, and his only thought was how profoundly uninspired he was by her. He was weary of her constant belief in him, weary of her quiet strength, and weary of her unwavering loyalty. Tonight was the culmination. He had been laying the groundwork for months, waiting for the right moment to execute his plan. Most would see a celebration as a barbaric time to end a marriage, but Liam viewed it as a brilliant strategic play. Eleanor was emotionally invested in this project, surrounded by his allies on his home turf. She would be too stunned to create a scene, too shattered to fight back. That's what Liam craved. A swift, clean demolition of his past. No messy emotional debris, no protracted disputes, just a sharp, clean break that would set him free. A big hello to everyone joining us, and welcome. Before we dive back in, please show your support for our channel by liking and subscribing. We would also be thrilled to see in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Are you with us from London, or Sydney, or Mumbai, or Rio? It is always incredible to see our global community. Now, back to our story. The energy in the impeccably designed penthouse was electric, a fusion of vintage champagne and raw ambition. It was one of those flawless Chicago nights, crisp and clear, when the city feels like the absolute center of the world. A curated list of about 200 industry elites circulated, a sea of haute couture and custom suits. The skyscraper, the apex, was Liam's masterwork, and this was its grand unveiling. Eleanor stood near the vast floor-to-ceiling windows, one hand resting on the curve of her belly. A gentle, unexpected flutter from within was a private reminder that she wasn't truly alone. The tiny life she was carrying felt like a secret promise of a different kind of happiness. But in that moment, Eleanor felt utterly isolated. She felt invisible. Her father, Arthur, had always been her foundation in Liam's whirlwind world. When she was a girl, petrified of failing a math test, he'd patiently sit with her for hours, teaching her about logic and structure. When she was a young woman, heartbroken over a breakup, he told her she was a classic landmark in a world full of disposable glass boxes. After she married Liam and was drawn into his obsessive climb to the top, her father had called every single day, never to ask about awards or contracts, but simply to ask how she was doing. Now, with her father on a planned, off-the-grid trek through Patagonia and completely unreachable, Eleanor felt lost in the powerful undertow of Liam's ambition. "Are you okay?" her best friend Chloe whispered, gently touching her arm. Eleanor could only offer a weak smile, but she was a million miles from okay. She hadn't been for months, feeling a chasm growing between her and the man she adored. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for Liam. He should have been by her side, sharing this moment as a team. That's what partners were supposed to do. They shared the credit. But Liam wasn't looking for her. He was tucked away in a lounge area, deep in a hushed, intense conversation with a woman Eleanor recognized instantly. Victoria Sterling, the formidable developer whose backing could launch or sink a career. It was clearly more than a business discussion. His entire posture radiated a deep connection. He was completely absorbed by Victoria, leaning in so close their heads nearly touched. He seemed to have forgotten Eleanor's very existence, as if she were just another guest he needed to win over. Eleanor whispered his name, Liam, but her voice was swallowed by the celebratory din. She watched him reach out and casually brush a stray piece of lint from Victoria's lapel, a small, possessive gesture that made Eleanor's stomach tighten into a knot. It was a gesture of intimacy, the kind he once used only with her. The head of the city's planning commission was now at the podium. "We are here tonight to honor a true visionary, a man whose passion and genius, our founder, Liam Crawford, is a defining force in our city." Eleanor tried to feel the wave of pride she was supposed to, but her vision blurred with hot, angry tears that she fought to blink back. Her hands trembled as she held her belly, the baby kicking again, a sharp, insistent jab, as if it could sense the icy fear seeping into its mother's soul. "I am so sorry, my love," Eleanor whispered, the words a silent promise. "I am so sorry." The tributes continued. Speaker after speaker praised Liam's singular vision and his brilliant collaboration with Victoria and her firm. An influential blogger recounted how Liam once worked for 3 days without sleep to perfect a single design element. An early investor emotionally recalled how Liam had promised to make them all wealthy and how he had delivered. Through it all, Eleanor felt a profound, bone-deep chill, and Liam never once looked in her direction. After the final applause, the guests began to mingle. They came up to her with bright smiles, offering comments like, "You must be so incredibly proud," and "The two of you are such a dynamic duo." She tried to smile in return, but every kind word felt like a tiny, sharp cut. Then she saw Liam striding toward her, and Victoria was walking right at his side. For a heart-stopping moment, a desperate hope flared inside her. He's bringing the most powerful developer in the city to celebrate with me. But Liam wasn't coming to share his victory. He stopped a few feet away, his face a mask of cool indifference, with Victoria poised beside him like a sleek, expensive accessory. "Eleanor, we have to talk. Tonight." Eleanor's heart began to hammer against her ribs. "Tonight, Liam. It's a party. This isn't the right time." "It's the only time," he said, his voice low but inflexible. "This is about what happens next, and Victoria is a part of it." The finality in his voice was like a physical blow. It wasn't anger, it was the cold, flat sound of a deal being closed. She allowed him to guide her away from the party, toward the glass-enclosed observation deck that was the tower's main attraction. Her heels echoed loudly on the polished granite floor. He wasn't taking her somewhere private, he was putting her in the spotlight. The deck, designed to showcase his triumph, now felt like a display case. Her pulse roared in her ears. "What is happening, Liam?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You're frightening me." He gave a quick glance to Victoria, who offered him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Olivia, this is Chloe." The other woman's smile was polished and serene, the kind you saw on the cover of a business magazine. "We felt a face-to-face was the most transparent way forward," Julian said, his tone as cool and neutral as the gray walls of their Boston penthouse. "We're restructuring our holdings." The financial jargon felt obscene in their home, a place of soft textures and warm light. She couldn't process it. "What?" Olivia breathed, her hand flying to her swollen belly. "You heard me," he said, his eyes devoid of emotion. "I'm liquidating this position. Chloe and I are merging our interests for a new venture." The glittering lights of the Seaport district outside their window swam into a watery mess. Her other hand cupped her stomach, a desperate, flimsy shield for their unborn son. But why? The word felt like broken glass in her throat. "Julian, we're having a child. We're building a family. That's the liability, isn't it?" he replied, his arms crossed over his chest. He glanced at Chloe, who took a step closer. "Olivia," Chloe began, her voice smooth and confident, like a quarterly earnings report. "We've run the numbers. A dependent isn't a variable that aligns with the long-term growth strategy we've projected." The cold, clinical audacity of this woman discussing her child like a line item on a spreadsheet stole the very air from Olivia's lungs. She looked at Julian, begging him with her eyes to make it stop. "How can you let her?" she choked out, hot tears shattering the city lights into a million tiny shards. "How can you stand there while she talks about our son like some bad debt to be written off? How could you even think something so brutal?" "I think about risk and reward all day, Olivia," Julian said, his voice flat. "I think this marriage was a poor allocation of capital. I think I've been over-leveraged in an underperforming asset for years, and I am certain I deserve a portfolio with a higher yield." "Something more," Olivia whispered, the words barely audible. "More than what, Julian? More than me? More than our son?" He tapped the large dark screen of the smart home hub on the wall of their penthouse. "The separation agreement has been uploaded to the secure server," he said, his tone as crisp as a new banknote. "My authorization is already on file. You just need to add your credentials, and we can consider this transaction settled." Olivia stared at the glowing interface, her body trembling so violently that her reflection in the dark glass seemed to vibrate. Outside, the Zoccam Bridge glowed, a landmark he had once called the symbol of their unbreakable connection. She thought he was packing for a hedge fund conference in London. Instead, her husband, the man who had promised her a lifetime of returns, was executing a hostile takeover of their life while their baby kicked inside her. "Julian, please," she pleaded, reaching for his arm, but he pulled away as if her touch would tarnish his expensive suit. Not like this. Not before your trip. I'm carrying your son. We're supposed to be a family. You should have considered that before you stopped performing, he said, his voice completely clinical. Before what? Olivia's voice cracked, rising from a broken whisper to a cry that echoed in the minimalist space. What did I do wrong? Tell me, Julian, what was my unforgivable flaw? You got comfortable, Olivia, he said, a note of detached pity in his voice. You're always talking about feelings, about art. You just dabble with your little consulting clients. You lost your competitive edge. Look at yourself. You've let your portfolio stagnate. I'm pregnant, she yelled, the last shred of her control snapping. I am 32 weeks pregnant with our baby. Of course I'm exhausted. Of course my body has changed. How can you be so cruel? I'm not being cruel, Julian countered, carefully straightening the knot of his silk tie as if preparing for a board meeting. I'm being pragmatic. I don't love you, Olivia. I haven't for a while, and I am done managing a failing investment. Olivia clutched her belly, feeling the baby stir, a sudden frantic movement as if he could sense her world collapsing. The room tilted, and a wave of nausea swept over her. She wanted to scream, to hurl the tablet at the wall, to destroy the cold, perfect world he valued more than anything. Just execute the agreement, he said. Let's not introduce any more volatility to the process. No, Olivia replied, her voice shaking but laced with a new, brittle strength. I will not sign it. You don't get to just divest me from my own life. As you wish, Julian shrugged, completely unconcerned. My legal team will handle the hostile acquisition, but I promise you, Olivia, that is a losing trade. You have no leverage. No significant income since you went freelance, no major holdings, no real capital. That little inheritance your grandmother left you is a rounding error. You have nothing, and you will be outmaneuvered at every turn. Every word was a calculated, devastating blow. The most sickening part was that he was right. Olivia had stepped back from her demanding gallery director position at his urging so she could focus on a stress-free pregnancy. He promised to secure their financial future. He told her to focus on cultivating their family. And she had believed him because she loved him, because she thought their partnership was sound. How could you do this? She managed to say, the words feeling like stones in her throat. Who are you? Julian didn't reply. He glanced at the platinum watch on his wrist, the very image of a man whose time was money. My car is waiting, he said. Sign the papers, Olivia. The partnership is dissolved. And with that, he picked up his leather briefcase, turned, and walked away. He walked down the long, art-lined hallway without a second glance, past the abstract paintings she had chosen and the smart lighting she had programmed. He got into the sleek black town car that idled at the curb and was instantly swallowed by the flow of evening traffic. Olivia watched it disappear before her knees gave out. She slid down the cold plaster wall to the polished oak floor, a lone figure in a vast empty gallery of her own life. She hugged her belly and wept, a silent, wrenching sorrow that shook her to her core. Her sister Amelia was the first person she was able to call. Liv? Oh my God, what's wrong? Are you okay? Is it the baby? But Olivia couldn't form words. Only choked, broken sobs came out as she held her stomach, a raw sound of pain escaping as her carefully curated life was torn from the walls. One of the doormen must have called Amelia back, thinking Olivia was in labor. Amelia was there in 20 minutes, her face a storm of fear and fury. She helped Olivia to her feet, guiding her out of the cold, sterile penthouse. Amelia drove her to the old, cozy brownstone she'd inherited in the South End, the one place Julian had no stake in. He'd always dismissed it as having no resale value. Amelia got her inside and settled her onto a worn velvet couch. She made her a cup of chamomile tea Olivia couldn't taste. She found a heavy, hand-quilted blanket to wrap around her that Olivia couldn't feel. She murmured soft, comforting words that Olivia couldn't hear. Olivia just sat there, staring at the familiar, slightly peeling paint on the ceiling of her sister's home, clutching the cold, heavy tablet that contained the order to liquidate her entire world. She couldn't fathom how one conversation could erase a decade of shared history. Her husband was gone. She was 8 months pregnant with a minimal income, no access to their joint accounts, and no prospectus for the future. In the space of an hour, Olivia's entire life had been declared bankrupt, or so it felt. For the next week, Olivia existed in a thick gray fog. She ate only when Amelia sat with her, patiently urging her to take a bite. She slept only when exhaustion finally overtook the grief. She ignored her phone, which buzzed incessantly with emails from Julian's attorney, a partner at a top firm whose messages were curt and demanding, inquiring if she had reviewed the settlement terms. She would sit in her sister's bay window, surrounded by overflowing bookshelves that smelled of old paper and dust, and gaze out at the small, untamed garden. The house was quiet. No hum of a climate control system, no sharp ring of a private elevator, only the gentle groan of old pipes. The tablet lay on the end table, its screen a dark, silent mirror. Every cardboard box stacked in the corner of the Boston penthouse felt like a monument to her failure. The divorce proceedings were a hostile takeover, the collapse of a merger she'd invested everything in, the brutal liquidation of the family she was weeks away from starting. Her sister, Amelia, was a constant presence, showing up with nourishing soups and fierce loyalty. "You have to eat, Liv," she would insist, her hand on Olivia's pregnant stomach. "This little guy is dependent on you." Olivia would manage a few spoonfuls for her sister's sake, but her appetite was gone. At night, adrift in the king-size bed they had picked out together, she would speak to her unborn son. "I'm so sorry," she'd whisper, her hands a protective shell around her belly. "I'm sorry your father decided you were a bad investment, but I promise you, my sweet boy, I will be enough. I will build us a life rich in things that can't be bought or sold." The baby would stir, a soft kick that felt like a secret agreement, and Olivia would cry until an exhausted sleep claimed her. Then on a cold, rainy evening, a new email from Julian appeared in her inbox. She almost deleted it, too weary to read another word, but the subject line was simple: finalizing asset division. A cold fury began to burn through the fog in her gut. She opened it. It was a sterile, one-line message: "My office, tomorrow at 10, to sign the final papers." Who is this? My name is Liam Sterling. I'm a junior associate at Blackwood Capital. I was a colleague and, I'd like to think, a protege of your husband, Arthur Vance. I was on a business trip in Singapore and just heard the terrible news about the accident. My deepest sympathies for your loss. Ilara felt the familiar ache tighten her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Mrs. Vance," he continued, his tone becoming urgent. "I know this is a terrible time, but I need to ask about his office. I have to believe he kept physical copies of his research, his private market analyses. They're essential to the future of the firm." Ilara was baffled. His research? My husband was a mid-level risk analyst. He was brilliant, of course, but he mostly worked on municipal bond stability. A moment of charged silence hung on the line. "Ilara," Mr. Sterling said, his voice now almost pleading, "please, it is vital that I get access to his home office. This is more significant than you can possibly comprehend." The raw conviction in his voice, an investor's certainty that cut through her fog of grief, was compelling. She gave him the address to their Boston brownstone, agreeing to let him come by the next morning. This wasn't just a coworker paying his respects. This felt different. A flicker of intrigue cut through her sorrow. Why would a top associate be desperate to see the paperwork of a man who lived a quiet life and never once brought his work home? For the first time in a week, she drew a long, hot bath. She chose a simple cashmere maternity sweater, pulling a comb through her hair without a single glance at her reflection. The exhaustion etched onto her face was more than she could stand to see. Liam Sterling arrived at 10 o'clock on the dot. He was a man in his early 30s, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that seemed at odds with the quiet, book-lined living room. His eyes, sharp and analytical, swept past the condolence bouquets and landed on a framed, complex-looking chart of market volatility that Ilara had always teased Arthur about. A small, knowing smile touched his lips. "You must be Ilara," he said, his handshake firm and brief. "You have your husband's quiet focus." Ilara led him to the small study Arthur had used as a home office, and the young man froze in the doorway, his confident posture collapsing. He entered the room as if it were a vault, his gaze darting between the packed bookshelves and the worn leather-bound ledgers on the desk. "I haven't seen a setup like this in my entire career," he breathed, his voice filled with a strange reverence. "Arthur was a purist. After you got pregnant, he told me he was simplifying his portfolio." Ilara stood behind him, a cold sense of confusion creeping up her spine. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," she said. "Simplifying what, exactly?" Liam stared at her, his expression a careful blend of pity and awe. "My dear," he started, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "your husband was far more than a risk analyst. He was Cassandra." In the early 2000s, he was a legend, a ghost on the trading floor. His predictive models are rumored to be the secret engine behind some of the most successful hedge funds in the world. He gestured with his pen toward the glittering financial district visible from their conference room window. He told everyone he'd taken a step back for a quiet life as an in-house consultant. No one knew he was still the most revered forecaster in the game. Ilara just looked at him, the words echoing in the silent room like a foreign language. It felt like a scene from a financial thriller, not her life. That doesn't make any sense," she managed to say. "Your husband," Liam said, his eyes shining with an almost manic energy, "built a legacy of predictive algorithms and private investment portfolios worth a fortune. It's his life's work. It is, quite possibly, the most valuable and closely guarded collection of financial intelligence on the planet." He glanced around the opulent office, then his eyes locked on hers, burning with a strange, calculating heat. "Ilara, your husband didn't leave you with debt and a mortgage. He left you an empire. He had operated as a ghost, a phantom investor, building unshakable portfolios for the world's wealthiest families. His final series of trades was pending a settlement of over 9 figures. Ilara's world spun. She shook her head, trying to clear it. "No, that's not right. My husband managed our simple retirement fund. We live in a modest townhouse in Beacon Hill. He drove a 15-year-old Volvo. He wore tweed jackets. He was just normal. That, my dear, is because he was the most brilliant actor I have ever met," his estate lawyer clarified over the encrypted video link. "He despised that world. His passion was for the purity of the numbers, the pattern, and for you. He wanted you to have a normal life, away from the greed and the pressure of his clients. He wanted you to love him for the man he was, not for the fortune he commanded." "But why hide it from me?" Ilara cried, the weight of a decade of secrets pressing down on her. "Why build our marriage on a lie?" The lawyer's professional demeanor softened. "He had his reasons, Ilara, very good ones. About 6 months ago, Arthur initiated this final investment sequence. He intended for it to be his exit, a way to be finished for good and focus entirely on what he cared about, you and your baby." Ilara's hand instinctively covered her belly. Arthur had been so thrilled, already designing a trust fund for their unborn child's education. As he structured this final portfolio, the lawyer went on, he arranged for the entire capital and its earnings to be transferred into a blind trust, registered solely under your name. "How much?" Ilara asked, her voice barely audible. The lawyer put a document on the screen. It was a statement from a private Swiss bank. Ilara stared at it. Below a string of account numbers and legal disclaimers was the closing balance. She read it once, then again, her brain refusing to compute the number of zeros. $200 million. The walls of her study felt like they were shrinking, the air growing thin and cold. Ilara gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. That can't be real, she whispered. It is 100% real, the lawyer stated. And according to his final will and testament, every last cent belongs to you. You are the sole beneficiary, his one and only heir. Ilara felt like she was suffocating, like the truth had stolen all the oxygen from the room. She pressed a hand to her chest, her heart hammering. "Are you okay, Ilara?" the lawyer asked, a note of genuine alarm in his voice. "Do you need me to call someone?" "I'm fine," Ilara managed to say. Why? Why wouldn't he ever tell me?" The lawyer paused for a long moment. "Ilara, your husband knew you were planning to file for divorce." The attorney cleared his throat. "He saw how restless you were becoming, Olivia. He noticed how your husband's boss, Isabel, was always turning up, the constant texts, the way she steered every conversation to how a woman with your vision was being held down by a small-town life." He found a draft of an email on the shared tablet, a conversation between Liam and Isabel. He was telling her you felt trapped by his simpler ambitions. "Your father told me, and I'm quoting his notes here, Isabel doesn't want my daughter. She wants the Hawthorne name. She's poisoning Olivia against the life they've built so she can get her hands on our family's legacy." A deep, glacial coldness crept into Olivia's very marrow. "My father, he wrote that?" "He did. It devastated him. But he was worried for you, especially after he learned you were pregnant. He wanted to tell you everything, but he was afraid that if you left Liam, Isabel would find some way to entangle you, to use you as leverage to gain access to the Hawthorne development funds. He was afraid you'd trade one cage for another, no matter how beautiful it looked." The hot sting of tears finally broke through, carving paths down Olivia's cheeks. "He was trying to protect me." "Yes," the attorney said softly. "He made me promise not to execute the will until after his final affairs were settled. He said that if you still decided to leave Liam after this, you would need these resources to disappear, to create a safe world for you and your child. He wanted to ensure that I and his grandchild would be safe for the rest of our lives." The truth didn't just crack Olivia's composure, it shattered it completely. The sobs that ripped from her throat were raw, agonizing sounds, torn from a place of grief she never knew existed. Her father had seen it all. He had recognized Isabel's predatory ambition for exactly what it was, while Olivia had blindly accepted it as professional mentorship for her husband. And her father had spent the last years of his life constructing a financial fortress for her, an inheritance so protected and immense that no one could ever use her or her baby again. "Oh, Dad," she cried, the words ragged and broken. "I'm so sorry. I was so foolish. I am so sorry I ever pushed you away." Olivia ended the video call, feeling completely alien in her own body. The sorrow was a crushing weight, but beneath it, something else was beginning to form. A cold, razor-sharp rage. A new purpose. She walked over to the sleek glass desk in her Seattle condo. The separation agreement Isabel had so helpfully had Liam's lawyer's draft was sitting there, waiting for her signature. Olivia stared at it for a long moment. Then she powered on her laptop, opened a new encrypted document, and started to type. The title of the file was The Hawthorne Protocol. Rule number 1, maintain the facade. She considered her next move. She could expose Liam for the spineless opportunist he was. She could tell everyone how he had let his boss convince her that her loving, stable life was a failure, but that would ignite an ugly war, and stress was the last thing her baby needed. No, Olivia had to be methodical. She had to be clinical. Rule number 2, the legacy remains invisible. This was her foundation. Her father's attorney had been clear. If Liam or Isabel caught wind of the trust before the divorce was final, they would cling to her, fighting desperately for a piece of her future. The money was her freedom. It was her child's security. It had to stay a ghost. Rule number 3. The child is the only direction. Every single move Olivia made from this point forward would serve one singular goal: to keep her baby safe, cherished, and entirely removed from Liam's toxic world. Rule number 4. Find new ground. Olivia couldn't stay in Seattle. Every waterfront view, every coffee shop was tainted with the memory of his betrayal. She needed a new beginning, a place where she could cultivate a life worthy of the child she was carrying. She read the rules again, and a sensation she hadn't felt in years settled over her. Control. She was taking back the blueprint of her life. Picking up her phone, she sent a secure message to the attorney. "I've reached a decision," Olivia typed. "I am cutting all ties." A short delay, then the reply. "What is your proposed course of action?" "I'm going to tell him I've had a change of heart, that he was right all along. Then I'm going silent, new number, everything." "A sound strategy," the attorney wrote back. Olivia could almost sense the quiet nod of approval. "If you vanish, he has no legal avenue to pursue you or to assert any claim on your child's life." Olivia's fingers flew across the screen of her burner phone. "There's just one last thing," she typed. "I have to get out of Seattle, Mr. Davies. My father—" "You mentioned he had other properties. Is there a place I can go? Somewhere completely private?" The response appeared within a minute. "Your father's private estate in the San Juan Islands, nearly 200 acres of protected coastline and old-growth forest, completely isolated. I can arrange for a private ferry for you in the morning." "Confirm it," Olivia sent back. The following morning, it was Mr. Davies himself who met her at a discreet private dock far from the bustling city. The iconic Seattle skyline faded into the morning mist behind them, replaced by the deep greens and blues of the Puget Sound. They navigated through a narrow channel marked by natural stone formations, the name Ironwood Point etched into a large piece of driftwood, and motored into a secluded deep-water cove. Olivia's fingers flew across the screen of her burner phone. "There's just one last thing," she typed. "I have to get out of Seattle, Mr. Davies. My father—" "You mentioned he had other properties. Is there a place I can go? Somewhere completely private?" The response appeared within a minute. "Your father's private estate in the San Juan Islands, nearly 200 acres of protected coastline and old-growth forest, completely isolated. I can arrange for a private ferry for you in the morning." "Confirm it," Olivia sent back. The following morning, it was Mr. Davies himself who met her at a discreet private dock far from the bustling city. The iconic Seattle skyline faded into the morning mist behind them, replaced by the deep greens and blues of the Puget Sound. They navigated through a narrow channel marked by natural stone formations, the name Ironwood Point etched into a large piece of driftwood, and motored into a secluded deep-water cove. As they approached the shore, the sight stole Olivia's breath. The main house was a masterpiece of Pacific Northwest modernism, built from cedar, glass, and dark local stone, with a sweeping deck that offered an uninterrupted view of the Sound and the distant, snow-capped mountains. A wide path made of smooth river stones meandered down to a private boathouse, where a sturdy-looking vessel bobbed gently in the water. The air, clean and sharp with the scent of salt and cedar, was a universe away from the city's exhaust-filled streets. "My father owned all of this?" Olivia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He bought it a decade ago," Mr. Davies replied gently. "He called it his sanctuary. He always said it was for you, a place where his grandchildren could learn the names of the trees and grow up strong and free." Olivia pressed her hand against the boat's railing, her eyes following the rugged, tree-lined coast. Seeing this incredible refuge, she understood with painful clarity that her father had been planning for her future all along, a legacy for the grandchild he would never meet. It was a final, silent gift. "I'm staying here," Olivia said, her voice filled with a sudden, powerful certainty. "This is where I'm going to raise my baby. Mr." A wide path made of smooth river stones meandered down to a private boathouse, where a sturdy-looking vessel bobbed gently in the water. The air, clean and sharp with the scent of salt and cedar, was a universe away from the city's exhaust-filled streets. "My father owned all of this?" Olivia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He bought it a decade ago," Mr. Davies replied gently. "He called it his sanctuary. He always said it was for you, a place where his grandchildren could learn the names of the trees and grow up strong and free." Olivia pressed her hand against the boat's railing, her eyes following the rugged, tree-lined coast. Seeing this incredible refuge, she understood with painful clarity that her father had been planning for her future all along, a legacy for the grandchild he would never meet. It was a final, silent gift. "I'm staying here," Olivia said, her voice filled with a sudden, powerful certainty. "This is where I'm going to raise my baby." Mr. Davies, her father's loyal advisor, gave a small, respectful smile. "It has always been here, waiting for you." Over the following 2 weeks, Olivia dedicated herself to bringing the estate to life. She brought in a local crew to open up the lodge and polish its warm, wide plank floors. A specialty moving service carefully transported the few sentimental items from the condo she had once shared with Liam. She consulted with a designer to create a nursery that felt like a secret forest clearing, with walls the color of moss and a mobile of hand-carved eagles and orcas. Davies, her father's loyal advisor, gave a small, respectful smile. "It has always been here, waiting for you." Over the following 2 weeks, Olivia dedicated herself to bringing the estate to life. She brought in a local crew to open up the lodge and polish its warm, wide plank floors. A specialty moving service carefully transported the few sentimental items from the condo she had once shared with Liam. She consulted with a designer to create a nursery that felt like a secret forest clearing, with walls the color of moss and a mobile of hand-carved eagles and orcas. A beautiful cradle carved from a single piece of reclaimed cedar stood in the corner, and the shelves were filled with illustrated books of local legends and soft plush forest animals. On Mr. Davies's firm recommendation, she also hired a top-tier security advisor. They installed a sophisticated but discreet surveillance network covering the entire property line, and a 2-person security team was stationed at the private ferry dock 24/7. "No one steps foot on Ironwood Point unless they are on your approved list," the head of security assured her. "You and your child will be completely secure here." Following Mr. Davies's other crucial piece of advice, Olivia scheduled a telehealth appointment with a therapist. Her name was Dr. Chen, a woman whose calm demeanor was backed by a clear, sharp intelligence. "You have weathered an incredible emotional storm," Dr. Chen said in their first session. A beautiful cradle carved from a single piece of reclaimed cedar stood in the corner, and the shelves were filled with illustrated books of local legends and soft plush forest animals. On Mr. Davies's firm recommendation, she also hired a top-tier security advisor. They installed a sophisticated but discreet surveillance network covering the entire property line, and a 2-person security team was stationed at the private ferry dock 24/7. "No one steps foot on Ironwood Point unless they are on your approved list," the head of security assured her. "You and your child will be completely secure here." Following Mr. Davies's other crucial piece of advice, Olivia scheduled a telehealth appointment with a therapist. Her name was Dr. Chen, a woman whose calm demeanor was backed by a clear, sharp intelligence. "You have weathered an incredible emotional storm," Dr. Chen said in their first session. "The shock of your father's death, immediately followed by the discovery of your husband's betrayal during your pregnancy. These are seismic events that require a period of intentional healing." She looked at Olivia through the screen, her voice both kind and direct. "Asking for support is not a sign that you are broken, Olivia. It is a sign of immense strength." With Dr. Chen's guidance, Olivia began to sort through the emotional wreckage. She learned that the cold fury she felt toward Liam wasn't something to suppress, but a protective barrier against his gaslighting. She came to accept that grief was not a linear path, but a wild, unpredictable tide, with moments of calm and sudden violent storms. Most importantly, she realized she didn't have to be a perfect victim or a perfect hero. She just had to be present for herself and her unborn baby. The shock of your father's death, immediately followed by the discovery of your husband's betrayal during your pregnancy. These are seismic events that require a period of intentional healing. She looked at Olivia through the screen, her voice both kind and direct. Asking for support is not a sign that you are broken, Olivia. It is a sign of immense strength. With Dr. Chen's guidance, Olivia began to sort through the emotional wreckage. She learned that the cold fury she felt toward Liam wasn't something to suppress, but a protective barrier against his gaslighting. She came to accept that grief was not a linear path, but a wild, unpredictable tide, with moments of calm and sudden violent storms. Most importantly, she realized she didn't have to be a perfect victim or a perfect hero. She just had to be present for herself and her unborn baby. With every sunrise over the Boston Harbor, Clara felt a little more herself. She'd take long, quiet walks along the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, the crisp New England air a welcome clarity. She started baking again, simple, fragrant breads that made her small apartment feel like a home. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was sleeping through the night. She'd talk to the baby constantly, her voice a low hum of promises and dreams. "We're going to build such a beautiful life, my little love," she'd whisper, one hand cradling her growing belly as she watched the sailboats in the distance. "A world full of books and art just for us, I swear it." And as the city's historic skyline stood watch, for the first time since her marriage fell apart, Clara felt the solid truth of that promise. Meanwhile, in his glass-walled office downtown, Julian was learning that the skyline he'd planned to conquer was built on a foundation of debt and bravado. With every sunrise over the Boston Harbor, Clara felt a little more herself. She'd take long, quiet walks along the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, the crisp New England air a welcome clarity. She started baking again, simple, fragrant breads that made her small apartment feel like a home. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was sleeping through the night. She'd talk to the baby constantly, her voice a low hum of promises and dreams. "We're going to build such a beautiful life, my little love," she'd whisper, one hand cradling her growing belly as she watched the sailboats in the distance. "A world full of books and art just for us, I swear it." And as the city's historic skyline stood watch, for the first time since her marriage fell apart, Clara felt the solid truth of that promise. Meanwhile, in his glass-walled office downtown, Julian was learning that the skyline he'd planned to conquer was built on a foundation of debt and bravado. The luxury tower he'd envisioned was proving to be a hollow and staggeringly expensive dream. The first fissure appeared, as it often does, in the accounts. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the latest cost overrun report from his contractor. $75,000 in a single week. A wave of dizziness and cold fury washed over him. "This is insane," he breathed. Isabel, his lead architect and new partner, barely looked up from the blueprints spread across her desk. Her jet-black hair was cut in a sharp, modern style. "Well, there's the imported Italian marble, the consultant we flew in from Dubai, the investor dinners at Oya, my private car service, and the groundbreaking ceremony we hosted at the ICA. I can see the receipts, I get it," Julian snapped. "We have to pull back. Now." The luxury tower he'd envisioned was proving to be a hollow and staggeringly expensive dream. The first fissure appeared, as it often does, in the accounts. Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the latest cost overrun report from his contractor. $75,000 in a single week. A wave of dizziness and cold fury washed over him. "This is insane," he breathed. Isabel, his lead architect and new partner, barely looked up from the blueprints spread across her desk. Her jet-black hair was cut in a sharp, modern style. "Well, there's the imported Italian marble, the consultant we flew in from Dubai, the investor dinners at Oya, my private car service, and the groundbreaking ceremony we hosted at the ICA. I can see the receipts, I get it, Julian snapped. We have to pull back, now. Isabel had no intention of pulling back. Julian, I am done designing a landmark from a rented office suite, she announced, rolling up the blueprints with a sharp crackle. We need a proper showcase. I'm thinking a penthouse sales gallery in the Prudential Tower. It needs a full virtual reality walkthrough, custom commissioned furniture, a champagne bar for clients, and a dedicated concierge. You did promise me we were going to build an icon, didn't you? Isabel, a lease like that is millions, Julian protested, his voice strained. So, she replied, her tone like chilled steel. You told me your financing was solid. You said you were the new face of Boston real estate. Was that all just talk? No, of course not, Julian lied, feeling a bead of sweat trace a path down his spine. The truth was, his flagship development project, once lauded as the future of luxury living, was hemorrhaging money. The reason was brutally simple. Julian had lost focus. Isabel had no intention of pulling back. Julian, I am done designing a landmark from a rented office suite, she announced, rolling up the blueprints with a sharp crackle. We need a proper showcase. I'm thinking a penthouse sales gallery in the Prudential Tower. It needs a full virtual reality walkthrough, custom commissioned furniture, a champagne bar for clients, and a dedicated concierge. You did promise me we were going to build an icon, didn't you? Isabel, a lease like that is millions, Julian protested, his voice strained. So, she replied, her tone like chilled steel. You told me your financing was solid. You said you were the new face of Boston real estate. Was that all just talk? No, of course not, Julian lied, feeling a bead of sweat trace a path down his spine. The truth was, his flagship development project, once lauded as the future of luxury living, was hemorrhaging money. The reason was brutally simple. Julian had lost focus. He was ignoring calls from his frantic project manager, dodging deadlines from city inspectors, and making lavish promises he couldn't keep. He'd become so consumed with Isabel and playing the part of a visionary developer that he had neglected the fundamental business of building. One by one, his primary lenders had grown wary and tightened their lines of credit. Without capital, construction would halt. And without progress, there was no way to pay for the first-class flights, the bespoke suits, the exclusive industry galas, and the endless parade of luxuries required to keep Isabel impressed. To make matters worse, the charming brownstone in the South End he'd owned with Clara, which he'd planned to sell for a quick cash injection, was languishing on a stagnant market without a single serious offer. He was ignoring calls from his frantic project manager, dodging deadlines from city inspectors, and making lavish promises he couldn't keep. He'd become so consumed with Isabel and playing the part of a visionary developer that he had neglected the fundamental business of building. One by one, his primary lenders had grown wary and tightened their lines of credit. Without capital, construction would halt. And without progress, there was no way to pay for the first-class flights, the bespoke suits, the exclusive industry galas, and the endless parade of luxuries required to keep Isabel impressed. To make matters worse, the charming brownstone in the South End he'd owned with Clara, which he'd planned to sell for a quick cash injection, was languishing on a stagnant market without a single serious offer. The lenders blamed market uncertainty. Julian was convinced his general contractor was incompetent. I just need you to trust the vision, he pleaded with Isabel. Give me one more month and I'll have the next round of funding secured. That's what you said last month. Isabel's voice had a sharp, brittle quality. Their conversations became a nightly siege, a corrosive loop of blame and justification. Isabel would rail against the compromised budgets. Julian would lash out about her expensive tastes. She would threaten to walk and take her designs with her. He would spin a new web of financial projections and desperate reassurances. It was a frantic, spiraling descent. One night, during a particularly bitter argument, Julian's phone buzzed. It was his lawyer, Mr. Pierce. Julian, we've received a counteroffer we must discuss immediately, the lawyer said, his tone clipped and formal. Clara has replied. A powerful wave of relief washed over Julian. It was the first glimmer of good news in what felt like a lifetime. But she has presented her own unalterable conditions, Mr. Pierce continued. What conditions? Julian asked, the relief instantly curdling into a familiar sense of dread. She is filing for full, sole legal and physical custody of the baby, and she is petitioning the court for you to formally and permanently relinquish all parental rights. It was the first glimmer of good news in what felt like a lifetime. But she has presented her own unalterable conditions, Mr. Pierce continued. What conditions? Julian asked, the relief instantly curdling into a familiar sense of dread. She is filing for full, sole legal and physical custody of the baby, and she is petitioning the court for you to formally and permanently relinquish all parental rights. That's not possible, Julian shouted into the phone. On the contrary, Julian, it's a masterstroke, his attorney said, his voice as dry as parchment. Let's be realistic. You have zero leverage. If you contest this, we enter a discovery phase. She'll file for alimony and support, and given your project's current financial instability, the fallout would be catastrophic for you and your investors. Julian began to protest, but the fight just drained out of him. His lawyer was correct. He was on the brink of total collapse. A contentious divorce battle was a disaster he could not afford. And if he were brutally honest with himself, a baby was a complication he didn't want. The threat of a custody dispute was just a tactic, a cruel way to make Clara anxious. Fine, Julian spat, the word tasting like ash. I'll sign it. A prudent decision, Mr. Pierce replied. The documents will be couriered to your office in the morning. Julian hung up and stared out at the lights of Boston. Isabel had been observing him from the other side of the room. So that's it? You're just going to let her erase you from your own kid's life? She asked. I don't have a choice, he snapped. But what about child support? Isabel pushed. You could have buried her in payments for the next 18 years. Clara's got nothing, Julian said, his voice thick with resignation. Her dad was just some bookish art professor at Harvard, lived in the same dusty apartment for 30 years. He probably left her a library card and a pile of student loan debt. You can't squeeze blood from a stone. Isabel let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor. So you detonated your marriage and your career for what, exactly? No heiress, no trust fund, not a single family connection to leverage. What on earth was your grand plan, Julian? You, he yelled, his voice cracking with the strain. I burned my entire world to the ground for you. Because you promised me a masterpiece. Isabel's voice was like a shard of ice. And what do I have now, Julian? I'm tied to a failing project with a developer whose name is turning to poison in this city. Frankly, my association with you is starting to look like the worst decision of my career. Her words hung in the air of the stark, modern apartment, colder than the wind off the Atlantic. 2 weeks later, Julian's signature was dry on the legal documents that severed his connection to the child he would have with Clara. The divorce was finalized. He told himself it was a clean cut, a necessary sacrifice. But late at night, when Isabel was asleep beside him and the city lights painted shadows on the walls, his mind would drift back to Clara. He couldn't help but wonder where she had settled. He wondered how she was managing the pregnancy by herself. He wondered, with a sickening twist in his stomach, if he had just made the single greatest mistake of his life. He tried her cell phone once, then twice, then a half dozen times over the next week. Each time, the call went straight to her soft, recorded voice. Clara, he said into the voicemail one night, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. I know what I did was unforgivable. I know I wrecked everything, but I'm worried about you and the baby. Just text me, please, just so I know you're okay. She never responded. There was only silence. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the divorce was absolute, and Julian was alone in the cavernous, half-finished penthouse of his failing development. Isabel was at an awards luncheon, likely scouting for her next visionary partner while maxing out their joint expense account. He was mindlessly scrolling through an architecture journal on his tablet, his brain numb, when a full-page feature stopped him cold, his thumb freezing above the screen. The Vance Collection, secret art trove to fund new wing at the Museum of Fine Arts. Arthur Vance. That was Claire's father's name. It had to be a different person. This couldn't be her father, the quiet man in the worn corduroy blazers. He tapped the image. The article loaded, and Julian's world began to come apart. The Boston arts community is reeling from the posthumous unveiling of the Vance Collection, an astonishing private collection of modernist masterpieces acquired by the unassuming Harvard professor Dr. Arthur Vance. The real shock, however, is the revelation that Dr. Vance quietly amassed a portfolio valued by auction houses to be well over $100 million, all of which will now be managed by a trust established for his sole heir. And beneath the text was a photo of a serene, pregnant Clara standing beside the museum's director, smiling dot model. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in Liam's gut. He forced himself to focus on the screen. Sources in the architectural world confirm Hawthorne lived an intensely private life, directing his vast real estate empire from a modest office in a repurposed historic cannery building, giving no indication of his true net worth. A modest office, an intensely private life. Liam's hands began to tremble so violently he almost fumbled his tablet. According to the estate's executor, David Davies, the entire Hawthorne portfolio will now be administered by his sole heir. Liam felt the air rush out of his lungs. That heir has now been publicly named as his daughter, Olivia Hawthorne, age 31. Then he saw the photograph. It was Olivia, but not the woman he thought he knew, not the quiet, unassuming art curator he had so easily dismissed. This Olivia was luminous. She stood on a rocky overlook, the vast Pacific Northwest wilderness behind her, one hand resting protectively on her pregnant stomach, which was elegantly outlined by a simple cashmere sweater. The wind was catching her hair, her expression was serene, and she had a soft, knowing smile that spoke of a deep, unshakable power. The photo in the financial section of the newspaper seemed to burn a hole in the page. Chloe Renaud, the quiet force behind the $2 billion Renaud Literary Foundation, photographed at the Chicago Public Library's annual gala. Julian let the paper fall from his grasp. It fluttered to the hardwood floor, but the image of Chloe, composed, graceful, and radiating a calm authority he'd never known, was branded into his mind. "No," Julian whispered, the word catching in his throat. "That's a mistake. It has to be." A $2 billion foundation. His ex-wife, the woman he had belittled as a mousy bookseller, the woman he'd left for someone with more ambition, was the head of a $2 billion philanthropic empire. He had divorced one of the city's most influential patrons of the arts. He had waived all rights to the unborn child of one of the city's most influential patrons of the arts. He had done it with a smug sense of superiority, practically celebrating his freedom from a future he saw as hopelessly dull. Julian shot up from the sofa, sending a half-full coffee cup crashing to the floor. He didn't even flinch. His entire focus had narrowed to a sickening hot knot twisting in his stomach. Just then, the apartment door swung open and Amber breezed in, her arms loaded with shopping bags from the Magnificent Mile. "Jewels, baby. You won't believe the deal I got it." Her sentence died, her vibrant smile fading as she saw the look of utter devastation on his face. "My God, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Liam couldn't form words. He just stood there, his face pale, his entire body shaking. Maya let her shopping bags drop to the floor and hurried over to him. Her gaze followed his to the laptop screen, where a major tech conference was being live-streamed. She saw the picture of Chloe, looking poised and powerful on the stage. Then Maya read the headlines streaming across the bottom of the screen. A horrified shriek escaped her lips, a raw, furious sound that bounced off the minimalist walls of their Seattle apartment. "Chief Executive Officer of Terrigen Innovations?" she screeched. "Chloe is the secret founder of Terrigen?" The argument that followed was the most vicious, soul-destroying fight they had ever had. For the next hour, they ripped each other apart. Maya accused him of being the most oblivious idiot to ever walk the earth. Liam roared back that she was the one who had pushed him to finalize the divorce so quickly, so they could start their fabulous new life. Maya hissed that if she had known Chloe was sitting on a $5 billion green energy deal, she would have told him to stay married and just keep her on the side. Liam called her disgusting. Maya just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and said he'd lost the right to judge anyone when he walked out on his pregnant wife. They flung accusations and blame like weapons, but beneath the fury was a single devastating truth. They had bet everything on their shared ambition and had just lost a prize bigger than they could have ever conceived. Finally, Liam snatched his wallet and keys from the quartz island. "And just where are you going?" Maya yelled after him. "To find Chloe," Liam said, his voice ragged. "I'm going to fix this." He drove like a man possessed, running red lights and weaving through the congested Seattle streets until he slammed to a stop in front of the gleaming glass headquarters of Teragen Innovations. The futuristic automatic doors were locked for the night, and a security guard in a crisp, dark uniform approached him immediately. "I have to see Chloe Sterling," Liam said, his words coming out in ragged bursts. "I'm her ex-husband." The head of security at the front desk glanced impassively at a tablet. "I'm sorry, sir, but you are not on the approved access list, Mr. Evans." Liam's composure completely crumbled. He started pleading, his voice thick with desperation, but a second, much larger guard materialized beside the first. "Chloe!" Liam bellowed toward the soaring, multi-story atrium, his voice echoing in the vast, silent space. "Chloe, I know you're in there. I made a terrible mistake. I am so sorry. I still love you. Chloe, please." His shouts were a hollow, pathetic sound absorbed by the polished concrete floors. No one answered. The security chief informed him in a monotone that if he did not leave the premises, the Seattle police would be called. Completely defeated, Liam trudged back to his car. For at least 5 minutes, he just stared up at the tower, a monument to his own spectacular failure, praying for a sign he knew would never come. What Liam didn't know was that Chloe was watching the entire miserable display on a security monitor in her office 30 floors up. She saw his frantic gestures, heard the faint, distorted sound of his yelling from the monitor's speaker, and she felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, not even a flicker of pity. There was just a deep, quiet stillness. She placed a hand on her pregnant belly, felt the gentle movement of the new life within her, and switched the monitor off. 2 days after his public meltdown, Liam was sitting across from his lawyer, a desperate, half-formed plan taking shape in his mind. "I want to challenge the divorce settlement," Liam announced. His lawyer, Mr. Davies, simply stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. "Liam, you cannot contest an agreement that you yourself insisted on speeding through simply because you saw your ex-wife revealed as a tech mogul on a live stream." "Why not? I've had a change of heart, Mr." Davies removed his glasses and began polishing them with a slow, deliberate motion. "Liam, let me paint you a picture. You go before a judge and argue that you want to nullify your own settlement because you just discovered your ex-wife is the CEO of a $5 billion company. Do you know what happens next? What? The judge will laugh you out of the courtroom, dismiss your case as the most shameless display of greed he has ever seen, and then he will almost certainly sanction you for wasting the court's time." Liam's face flushed with shame, but he pressed on. "What about my baby? I signed away my parental rights." "You signed an ironclad waiver of all parental claims," Mr. Garrett said, his tone clinical and sharp. "You stated, unequivocally, that you wanted no paternal connection, legal or otherwise, to this child." "I've reconsidered," Leo shot back. "The law, Mr. Vance, is not concerned with your reconsiderations," the attorney replied coolly. "You made a calculated business decision." An oppressive silence filled the high-rise Chicago office. "I cannot and will not represent you in this matter," Mr. Garrett finally stated. "What you are attempting is morally bankrupt, and any judge in this city will see it for what it is." Leo stormed out of the building. He found a different lawyer, a slick operator named Finn with a reputation for creative ethics who eagerly took on his paternity case. They all met in a downtown courtroom 3 weeks later. Clara arrived with her counsel, Miss Albright, and a team from a top-tier law firm. She wore a simple, elegant navy maternity dress, her expression serene and composed. At nearly 8 months along, her pregnancy was beautifully apparent. Leo showed up with Finn wearing his best charcoal suit, though the fabric was beginning to fray at the elbows. He tried to look confident, but a cold knot of anxiety was tightening in his gut. The judge was a man in his late 60s, Judge Miles, with sharp blue eyes, a mane of white hair, and an expression that conveyed he had seen every shade of human deceit in his 30 years on the bench. "Mr. Castillo," Judge Miles began, his eyes fixed on Leo's attorney over the top of his glasses. "The petition before this court is to establish parental rights for an unborn child, a child for whom your client, Mr. Vance, freely and, I am reading from the affidavit, with full comprehension and sound judgment, relinquished all legal rights less than 90 days ago. You understand you're facing a nearly vertical climb." Leo's lawyer stood, his shoulders squared. "Your Honor, my client was operating under extreme duress in his professional life at the time. He recognizes now that his decision was made in haste. His devotion to his unborn child is profound, and he wishes only to be a present and loving father." Judge Miles turned his gaze directly to Leo. "Is that a fair representation of your position, Mr. Vance?" Leo stood, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had rehearsed this. "It is, Your Honor. I made a terrible mistake. I was overwhelmed by a unique set of pressures and was not thinking clearly when I signed that document. I now know that being a father is the single most important thing in my life." The words seemed to float in the courtroom, almost believable, until Clara's lawyer, Miss Albright, rose from her chair. "Your Honor, may I have a moment to address the court?" "Proceed, Miss Albright," the judge said. "Your Honor, Mr. Vance's heartfelt plea is a carefully crafted fiction. His motives have nothing to do with a newfound sense of paternal duty. This is a desperate, cynical maneuver to gain leverage over my client's inheritance, the controlling stake in the Argent Restaurant Group." "That is a slanderous lie," Leo shouted. The judge's gavel struck the wood with a deafening crack. "Restrain yourself, Mr. Vance. You will get your turn. Miss Albright, you may continue." Instead of presenting documents, Miss Albright gestured toward the courtroom entrance. "Your Honor, the petitioner's claims are best refuted not by paper, but by a person. The defense calls Miss Simone Dubois to the stand." A woman with fiery red hair and a furious expression walked down the aisle. Leo went pale. It was his sous chef, his mistress. After she was sworn in, Miss Albright began. "Miss Dubois, can you tell the court what Mr. Vance said to you on the night of my client's father's passing?" Simone's voice was shaking but clear. "He told me the old man was finally gone and that our ship had come in. He said Clara was too grief-stricken to notice anything, and that this was our chance to take over the new flagship restaurant he had been planning. He promised me we would be partners." Miss Albright continued, "And what was his plan regarding his unborn child?" Simone looked directly at Leo, her eyes full of contempt. "He said the baby was an unfortunate complication. He said signing away his rights was a genius move to prove to Clara his focus was on the business, not her money. He called the child unwanted baggage." The memory hit him like a physical blow. The scene replayed in his mind with sickening clarity. Him cornering a shattered Clara in her late father's quiet study just a day after the funeral. He remembered setting the thick vellum documents on the antique desk, hiding them within a stack of condolence letters she needed to acknowledge. He remembered the vacant look in her eyes, the way her hand shook as she accepted his pen, her mind too clouded by loss to comprehend his treachery. He remembered leaving that house and meeting Simone at the bar they frequented, raising a glass of scotch to their golden future, leaving Clara to navigate her sorrow all alone. The shame was a hot, choking wave, and then he recalled the document he had so willingly signed, the notarized affidavit relinquishing all parental claims. He had even insisted on a cruel, gratuitous clause questioning Clara's fitness, citing the emotional instability of her condition, twisting the knife one last time. He could almost hear a judge's voice as gray and unforgiving as a Chicago winter sky. "Mr. Vance," that voice would ask with icy calm, "are these accusations true?" He risked a glance at Clara's profile across the room, and the answer screamed back at him in the crushing silence. Leo's lawyer, Mr. Castillo, was frozen, an effigy with nothing to say. "There are details. It's complicated," Leo stammered, his throat dry as dust. "Is it?" Judge Miles's voice cut through the room like shattered glass. "Explain to me how it's complicated. Explain why you were conspiring with your mistress to usurp your wife's family legacy while she was in mourning. Explain why you toasted to her father's death and called your own child unwanted baggage. Explain why you renounced that child, only to file this pathetic lawsuit the moment you realized my client was cutting you out of her billion-dollar culinary empire, suddenly rebranding yourself as a doting father-to-be." Leo's jaw worked, but no sound emerged. His silence condemned him. Judge Miles gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Mr. Vance, I have presided over this court for 3 decades. I have witnessed breathtaking acts of grace and horrifying acts of selfishness. But seldom have I seen a case where an individual's actions so blatantly prove that a child's welfare is their last and least concern. Every decision you made, from your emotional abuse of a grieving woman to this disgusting legal charade, was driven by one thing: avarice. Your petition for parental rights is denied, with the utmost prejudice. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent injunction. You will have no contact, direct, indirect, or by any other means, with Mrs. Vance or her child ever. Should you violate this order in any way, you will be immediately arrested and jailed. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Leo managed to whisper, the words feeling like sandpaper in his throat. "I'm sorry, I did not hear you," Judge Miles insisted, leaning forward. "Yes, Your Honor," Leo exclaimed, his voice breaking under the strain of his spectacular downfall. "Mrs. Vance," the judge said, his tone now gentle with respect, "this court is granting you sole, complete, and exclusive custody of your child, both legal and physical, from the moment of birth. Mr. Vance will have no rights, no visitation, and no standing whatsoever. I wish you and your baby all the peace, safety, and joy you so rightly deserve." "Thank you, Your Honor," Clara said, her voice unwavering. Leo stumbled from the courtroom, his skin on fire with shame. In the hallway, paralegals and clerks averted their eyes, but their hushed gossip was a wave that pursued him all the way to the elevators. The courtroom doors had been left ajar. The entire floor had heard everything. They all knew what he was. 3 months later, on a brilliant autumn morning in Chicago, when the air was crisp and sunlight danced on the surface of Lake Michigan, Clara gave birth to a beautiful, healthy daughter. The labor was a grueling 20-hour ordeal, but Clara discovered a well of inner strength she hadn't known she possessed. When the nurse laid her daughter on her chest, Clara gazed at the tiny, perfect creature and was flooded with a love so immense it felt like it was rewriting her own DNA. "Hello, my love," she whispered, tears of pure happiness tracing paths to her hairline. "I'm your mommy. I've been waiting for you my entire life." The baby opened her dark, curious eyes and seemed to gaze directly into her mother's soul. In that moment, the last year, the betrayal, the grief, the public humiliation, the fear, all of it dissolved into nothing. It had no place here, not in the presence of this miraculous little being. She was hers. That was the only thing that mattered now. "Do you have a name for her?" the nurse asked gently. Clara didn't need to consider it. The name had been a quiet certainty for months. "Rosemary," she said, her voice full of love. Her name is Rosemary, for her grandmother, for resilience. Clara remained in the hospital for 2 days. Her suite overflowed with flowers, an astonishing arrangement of gardenias from the Argent Group's board, a bright bouquet of sunflowers from her old colleagues at the Tribune, and dozens more from friends and well-wishers. There were cards and balloons and impossibly small gifts for the baby. There was absolutely nothing from Leo. Not a card, not an email, not a single solitary word. And for that complete, uninterrupted silence, Chloe was eternally grateful. When she brought baby Rowan home to her sleek, eco-friendly penthouse overlooking the Sound, everything was perfectly arranged. The nursery was a haven of serene minimalism, with a crib made from sustainable ash wood, soft organic cotton sheets, and a silver mobile of constellations that spun slowly in the afternoon light. Books about astrophysics and marine biology lined the shelves. A comfortable rocking chair was placed by the floor-to-ceiling windows, giving Chloe an unobstructed view of the Olympic Mountains as she fed her daughter. That first night, Chloe sat in that chair, Rowan sleeping soundly on her chest as the city lights began to glow below. "You will never know what that felt like," Chloe whispered to the sleeping baby. "You will never experience the shock of betrayal or the void of being abandoned. You will be raised with integrity and love. You will be cherished. You will always be protected." She kissed the top of her daughter's soft hair. "Your grandmother was a brilliant scientist who started this legacy," she murmured. "She wanted you to have a foundation to build your own world on, and I will guard that legacy. I am going to do something incredible with it. I am going to make her so very proud of us." The baby sighed softly in his sleep, his tiny hand clutching the fabric of her silk blouse, and Chloe allowed herself a small smile as a single resolute tear traced a path down her cheek. In the years that followed, Chloe committed herself to building a meaningful legacy. She launched the Sterling Initiative, an organization that provided seed funding and mentorship for women-led startups in the STEM fields, with a special program for single mothers rebuilding their lives after leaving toxic situations. Chloe knew the gut-wrenching pain of discovering Liam's betrayal, the profound sense of being adrift that came after. She was determined that no other woman should have to face that kind of despair alone. She wanted every woman forced to start over to know that she was not isolated, that support was available, and that a devastating chapter was not the end of her story. The initiative became a powerhouse for change. In just 5 years, it had helped launch more than 1,000 new companies across 4 different states. Chloe made sure to attend their summits, where she would sit and listen to the women, hearing their stories of hardship and celebrating their triumphs. At a tech conference one evening, a young woman named Jessica approached her. Jessica was 25, holding a sleeping child in her arms, her eyes shining with fierce determination. "Miss Sterling," Jessica said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I just had to come and thank you. After my husband left me, I was shattered. I had no career, no savings. I honestly believed my life was over. And then a friend told me about your initiative. Support, I have a company. I'm finishing my doctorate in computer science, and my son is in the best STEM preschool in the city. You built this new life from the code up," Chloe said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "That was all you, Jessica. I just offered the development kit. You're the one who wrote the new program, and it's more powerful than before." Chloe didn't just rebuild, she revolutionized. Taking the helm of the company her mother founded, she poured her energy into sustainable technology and clean energy solutions, fulfilling a family dream. Some of her early ventures were difficult, but her successes reshaped the industry. Her personal fortune grew exponentially. She began delivering keynote speeches, not about recovering from heartbreak, but about building an ethical, sustainable future. She became a global leader in green tech and women in leadership. She never once said Liam's name, but the entire tech world knew who had ignited her incredible drive. "True innovation," Chloe said in a now famous interview with a global business magazine, isn't about getting even. It's about building something so powerful that the noise from your past becomes completely irrelevant. She was celebrated. Tech journals put her on their covers. She won national acclaim for her foundation's initiatives, funding literacy programs in underserved communities across the country. Prestigious universities begged her to join their boards. She became a symbol of quiet philanthropy and sharp intellect. And all the while, little Leo grew up clever, happy, and deeply loved. On his first birthday, he took his wobbly first steps across the original oak floors of their restored Gold Coast mansion, and Chloe's delighted laughter echoed in the vaulted ceilings. He was a beautiful boy, with his mother's thoughtful eyes and an endlessly curious spirit. Chloe made sure Leo knew about the grandfather he never met. Every night, she told him stories of how Grandpa Renault was a master bookseller, a man who saw magic in dusty pages, and how he would have cherished his grandson more than any first edition. "Your grandfather built something that lasts, my sweet boy," Chloe would whisper to Leo, "and you have his love for stories. That's a legacy to be incredibly proud of." Julian's life moved in the opposite direction. The day the divorce was final, his carefully constructed new world began to crumble. First, Amber left. She sent him a short, cold email one morning explaining that his personal baggage had become a career liability and she needed to protect her brand. She wished him well. For 3 straight days, Ethan's calls to her went unanswered. He was a man obsessed, dialing her number relentlessly. By the 4th day, the calls no longer rang through. Ava had blocked him completely. The promising young sculptor he had staked his reputation on had chiseled him out of her life. His position as a senior partner at Vanguard Design Group was the next casualty. The board, which had long tolerated his arrogance because of his award-winning designs, finally invoked the conduct clause in his contract. The fallout had gone nuclear in Chicago's tight-knit architecture and art circles. The story of the star architect caught on a live stream during the unveiling of his latest skyscraper, publicly fawning over his artistic protege while presenting her with a rare set of Italian chisels, a set his wife had spent a year tracking down for their anniversary, was a spectacle too scandalous to ignore. No one in the industry would return his calls. Security escorted him from his corner office with its panoramic view of Millennium Park. He sold his vintage Porsche to cover the first round of legal fees. He abandoned his downtown penthouse for a soulless garden apartment in a sprawling complex out west, a place defined by stained carpets, a groaning air conditioner, and the lingering odor of microwaved dinners. Ethan's days dissolved into a haze of ignored emails. His nights were spent staring at the cracks in the ceiling, sleep a forgotten concept. He was a professional ghost. His name was radioactive. Any firm that looked him up was met with a flood of art blogs, scathing social media threads, and magazine articles detailing his epic public downfall. He was a phantom in the world he once dominated. Sometimes, in the suffocating quiet of the night, with the thud of a neighbor's music vibrating through the thin walls, Ethan would scroll through the images on his phone. There was one from their wedding day, Clara looking at him with a profound sense of trust that now felt like a physical blow. There was another from the day she told him she was pregnant, her face utterly radiant as she held up 2 blue lines on a test, her eyes shimmering with joyous tears. He had been given a life of beauty, of art, of genuine love, and he had methodically, foolishly, taken a wrecking ball to it all for a fleeting ego boost. One humid afternoon, Ethan was walking down Michigan Avenue, heading to a token interview he knew was a dead end, when he saw it. The cover of Chicago Magazine on a newsstand rack. It was a photograph of Clara holding their baby boy, Owen, who was giggling. She looked magnificent, serene, confident, and utterly complete. The baby's small hand rested against her cheek as she gazed directly into the camera. The headline screamed from the page, "The Morgan Touch, How Clara Morgan is Reshaping the City's Art Scene." Ethan Vance stood paralyzed on the bustling sidewalk, the city's noise of sirens and chatter dissolving into a low hum. He stared at the brilliant image of the woman he had discarded and the son he was no longer allowed to see, a wave of nausea rising in his throat. He was trapped in her orbit. Clara was Chicago's new cultural icon, her face appearing on talk shows and in print, where she spoke about championing local artists, her innovative gallery concepts, and her new fund for aspiring female creators. Each new achievement was another twist of the knife. Clara Morgan wins Curator of the Year. The Morgan Gallery named a top cultural destination. Her foundation launches a citywide art program for kids. The news was a relentless assault, every photo a new form of torture. A stark, cold reality finally shattered the remnants of his pride. Clara had never been just an art enthusiast. She had been a visionary. She wasn't just his support system. She was a creative force. She was never merely a component of his world. She had been its entire architectural foundation, and in his monumental hubris, he had demolished it. The destruction was total. The divorce was finalized. His parental rights terminated the moment he signed the paperwork, leaving a permanent, indelible black mark on his soul. There were no appeals, no do-overs, no path back to what he'd had. Ethan Vance, the man who built landmarks, was left with nothing but the rubble of his own life. It was a mild summer evening, nearly a year after Owen's birth. The broad bluestone patio of her Lincoln Park brownstone was awash in the golden light of dusk, casting a warm glow over the sculpture garden. Clara sat in a comfortable armchair, watching her son crawl across a soft blanket. Owen was on a quest, a determined little man, moving from a smooth river stone toward a cluster of solar-powered garden lights. A joyful stream of babbling sounds came from him. Her sister Chloe sat nearby, nursing a glass of wine. He has Grandpa's determined scowl, Chloe observed with a smile. Clara's own smile grew. I know. Sometimes, when he's staring at a new painting, the thought of Ethan appeared, sharp and jarring, catching the breath in her throat. They sat in companionable silence, watching Owen finally grab one of the glowing steaks with a squeal of victory. Your grandmother would be unbelievably proud of you, Chloe said, her voice soft, not just for elevating the family name or for all the recognition, but for how you handled it. The dignity you showed when you had every reason to just burn everything down. Clara gently pushed a small modern bassinet with her foot. Do you know the image that always comes back to me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I always return to that night at the skyscraper unveiling, standing there in that crowd, listening to the applause and then watching him call her to the podium with those chisels. I felt the entire world just vanish beneath my feet. I was certain my life was over. I thought I had lost everything and that I would be completely, utterly alone. Chloe reached out, her hand resting on Clara's. But I was mistaken, Clara went on. I wasn't alone. Grandma's strength was still there with me. My grandfather spent his entire life building a reputation in this city, a foundation I took for granted until that night. And this baby. Her expression softened as she glanced at Rowan, who was currently attempting to gum a coaster to death. This baby was my secret anchor, a tiny flutter in my womb that gave me a reason to draw up new plans. Chloe took a deep breath, her gaze following a boat gliding across the dark surface of Lake Michigan. I used to think Liam shattered me, she said, her voice a low murmur, but he didn't. He just created a massive empty site where our life used to be. And that was the most incredible thing he could have ever done for me. Not the settlement, not the condo, none of it. The real gift was his absence. It gave me the space to finally become the architect I was meant to be without his voice in my head telling me my designs were too ambitious. Maya dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Since when did you get so profound? Chloe let out a deep, genuine laugh. A therapist who charges $500 an hour, she replied. Many, many hours of therapy. Their shared laughter drifted out on the cool city air, mingling with the distant sound of traffic. Rowan looked up at the sound of his mother's voice and flashed a wide, toothless grin, kicking his legs in delight. "Mama!" he babbled, the sound clear and perfect. "Mama! Mama!" Chloe stood and scooped him into her arms, burying her face in the warm spot on his neck that smelled like powder and sweet milk. "Hello, my little builder," she whispered. "Did you have fun designing new ways to cause trouble?" "Designs," Rowan echoed with great seriousness, patting her cheek with his small hand. "That's right," Chloe said. "Much better ones. You are so brilliant, Rowan, just like your great-grandfather." She carried him inside, where the last of the evening light cut long, dramatic shadows across the hardwood floors. The apartment felt lived in, warm, filled with the evidence of a life being meticulously restored. The main hallway was a shrine. There was no framed photo of a smiling bride and groom. Instead, there was something far more meaningful. A large black and white photograph of her grandfather, Arthur Vance, looking sharp and intense over a drafting table in his first Chicago office, a T-square held like a king's scepter. Chloe paused before the picture, a nightly tradition. "Say goodnight to Grandpa Arthur," she prompted her son. "Night-night," Rowan mumbled, waving a chubby fist at the image. Chloe smiled and walked down the hallway to the nursery. She changed him into his pajamas, the ones patterned with tiny yellow hard hats, and settled into the rocking chair to tell him a story. "Once upon a time," Chloe began, "there was a single, sturdy brick that dreamed of becoming a great cathedral." Rowan snuggled into her shoulder, his breathing already slowing into a peaceful, steady rhythm. He was sound asleep before she'd finished the first sentence. She closed her eyes, rocking gently in the quiet room, feeling the solid, comforting weight of her son's heart beating against her own. "I need you to know this," she whispered into the dim light. "Your great-grandfather loved you generations before you were born. He spent his life creating things that would last, to make sure you would always have a strong foundation, always have a place in this city. Everything we have, all of this, is because he never let a single person tell him what he couldn't build." She kissed his downy hair. "And your father," she went on, her voice even softer, "your father made design choices that will be very difficult for you to understand someday. Maybe when you're much, much older, we can try to make sense of his blueprints together. But this is the truth you must always remember, Rowan," she whispered. "Your value is never determined by someone else's failure to see your worth. Your strength is not a blueprint that can be torn up by a careless hand. You are a masterpiece. You are cherished. You are more than enough. You always have been." Chloe settled Rowan into his crib, pulling the soft linen blanket over his little body. The mobile, a collection of delicate laser-cut models of Chicago skyscrapers, spun slowly above, casting shifting shadows on the wall. Chloe lingered in the doorway, mesmerized by the quiet rise and fall of his chest, his tiny fists curled beside his face. Innocent, whole, and safe. This was Chloe's world now. It wasn't the glamorous fantasy of being the wife and partner to a star architect, building an empire together. This was better. This was real. This was the story of a woman who was restoring her own life, using her family's legacy as her guide, discovering a structural integrity she never knew she had. She was building something magnificent from the wreckage of a lie. Chloe dimmed the nursery lights and walked down the hall to her bedroom. She paused by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering moonlit skyline. Somewhere across the city, in the cold, minimalist gleam of his award-winning firm, Liam was likely staring out at the same view, haunted by the warmth he had so carelessly demolished. But Chloe knew she hadn't truly thought about Liam in months. He was what her old professor would have called a structural failure, a fatal crack in the foundation discovered just before the real work began. There was no sense in revisiting the old plans. She understood her own strength now and was already drafting the future. Chloe slid between the cool, crisp sheets of her bed, pulling the comforter to her chin. On her nightstand, a tablet glowed, displaying the initial renderings for Keystone Preservation, her new independent firm. Next to it was a framed sonogram, a perfect little silhouette against the black. It was the most important design in the room, the cornerstone of everything she would ever build. "Thank you, Grandpa," Chloe whispered to the memory of her mentor. "Thank you for teaching me that the strongest structures are the ones that have been tested. I hope I'm making you proud." She set the tablet on its charger, switched off the lamp, and closed her eyes. Outside, the city hummed its electric, rhythmic song, and in the distance, a lone saxophone cried a bluesy, mournful melody that eventually faded into the night. Chloe Benoit slept peacefully, and her newborn son slept peacefully in the next room. They were safe. They were loved. They were, at long last, home. And that, you see, is where their true story begins. Always remember, your soul is not a project that loses its value just because one client with no vision rejected the design. Your worth is not a historic landmark to be gutted by a developer who never understood the beauty of its bones. Sometimes, the person who walks away from you is just clearing the site for the monument you are about to become. Sometimes, being overlooked is the greatest power you can have because it gives you the quiet space to build your legacy while no one is watching. And sometimes, the most profound victory has nothing to do with revenge at all. It is about designing a life so magnificent, so genuinely joyful, so structurally sound, that the person who tried to demolish it becomes nothing more than a footnote on a discarded blueprint. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Share this story with anyone who's ever had to draw up new plans for their life. Let us know in the comments how you would have handled Liam's betrayal. We are very eager to read your thoughts. Until the next story is built, hold your head high and remember that you are the architect of your own world, even if you have to start from the ruins. This narrative was meticulously designed by our writers to explore the harsh realities of betrayal and the strength it takes to rebuild. Thank you for being a part of this emotional journey with us.